This is an AMI podcast.
What I need is the dandelion in the spring, the bright yellow that means rebirth instead of destruction, the promise that life can go on no matter how bad our losses, that it can be good again. Welcome to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Ramia Amudan, the host of the show, here with our technical producer, Nisreen Abdel-Majid. And this is the podcast where we talk all things audiobooks on a weekly basis, with ourselves, with others, and we love to keep you posted on everything going on in the audiobook world as it stands today. Also, that quote that you just heard, where we love to start with our quotes as well, is from the book Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins. Now, this is book 3 of the Hunger Games series, if you were paying attention and thinking, well, where did I hear that? And also of the movies, if you're checking out that franchise instead. But we're featuring quotes of spring and new beginnings through April. So that was the inspiration around this quote. Now, dandelions, I just want to comment on that for a second. Dandelions could be seen as, what do we call them now? Weeds. Why that word didn't come to me. But we kind of think of them differently because spring's coming around the corner or already here when you see dandelions popping up around your area, or you got to weed them out if you're a gardener. So kind of a nice take, to have dandelions featured this way for spring. Moving on to the Sila homepage as we check out their featured titles at the very top. Heading level 2 if you're a screen reader user. Daughters of the Deer is the first one up there. This is by Danielle Daniel, historical fiction. We featured this a couple weeks ago on the show. The second one is Run Towards the Danger by Sarah Pauly. Family and relationship category for this one, and we talked about it in depth last week on our episode. And the last one of the feature titles category on the Sila homepage is Moonwitch, Spider King by Marlon James. And this is a fantasy category, so kind of a heads up as what to come later on in the show. And that you can check out celalibrary.ca. And over to you, Nisreen, because as usual, you have what's trending.
Yes, so audiobooks.com tweeted out this week's hottest new releases, starting off with The Investigator by John Sanford, Insomnia by Sarah Pinborough. Love that story, Observations from a Gorgeously Queer Life by Jonathan Van Ness. A Woman of Endurance by Dalma Lenos Figueroa. And the last one I'll mention is Theater of Marvels by Leanne Dillsworth. So if you want to see more of the hottest book releases this week, you can go to audiobooks.com and they have a full list. I just narrowed it down to the top list. Ramya, I wanted to ask you, because I sat this morning outside for like 5 minutes and enjoyed the beautiful, beautiful weather. Are you the type to find a spot outside and listen to an audiobook, or would you rather stay inside?
You
For
know
the
what? It
summertime.
really depends. Okay, for the summertime, absolutely. I love being outside, on the balcony, on a porch, at the beach, at a cottage. Oh, you know what? This is so reminiscent. Last year, I went to a cottage with my family, which, we've scarcely had time to take trips in the last 2 years. But I went to a cottage with my family, and I swear, Nisreen, they were asking if I was good because I was outdoors reading an audiobook by the fire, by the lake, pretty much all day for all 3 days. Didn't want to go on the car rides across to wherever. I didn't want to leave the cottage. I didn't even want to be indoors. Mosquitoes, no mosquitoes. I was out there with the audiobook all 3 days. So absolutely, outdoor audiobook listening is a huge plus for me. How about you? Do you have a preference for any kind of like relaxation, even if it's not necessarily audiobook listening, outdoors, indoors?
Yeah, I would prefer outdoors. I mean, I'm not into the sitting on the floor mosquitoes type of person. uh, I'm I'm being real with you. I'm not the typical camper type of person. I'm more of a hotel type of
Mm,
person. So when it comes to vacations, like I'm thinking about just sitting on the sand or sitting on a picnic chair on the beach or something and
as long as
listening
there's
to
no
an
mosquitoes.
audiobook. As long as
Right.
there's no mosquitoes or there's no
Okay.
bugs crawling on my chair, I will be fine.
This is like a
I'm
very
being straight with
specific.
you. This is
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah,
very
no, I get it.
honest this is a
Right.
very honest podcast. That's what you get.
Is it okay if there's birds around? Like, are birds
Yeah, of
okay?
course.
Okay.
I'm
Not that
okay. I'm
picky.
good.
Yeah,
Birds are fine. I have Fifi in the house, so we're okay.
true. Yeah, that's true. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, to me, like, I love curling up outside under, even under the stars, though I can't see them at nighttime with a blankie and listening to
Yeah.
audiobooks out there. Because you can, it's the vibe, right? Like, it's so different from
Yeah, it's
being
the
in the
mood.
city and construction and street
Hmm.
noise.
It's peaceful. It's peaceful, and
Hmm.
that's all that matters. I mean, and as you pointed out, like we can't see the stars, but just being in that setting, being in that environment, just hearing your
Right.
surroundings, you can picture yourself being under those stars and
Yeah.
visualizing that audiobook that you're listening to so
Oh, yeah.
peacefully.
It's true. The
Ah, yeah.
retention I feel is so much better when we're in these kind of circumstances and able to fully relax and focus on a book. It's just so different from, day to day routine and then squeezing an audiobook whenever
Hmm.
you can type thing. But nice. I
Yeah,
love this question. Thank you.
you got it.
I'm your host, Ramya Amudan, and we are going to be jumping into a pause or play. If you're new, this is the time where we go through a book, usually one that we've already discussed in the previous segment, and I tell you what it's all about based on the synopsis, and then you tell me if you would hit pause or play, aka listen to this audiobook or not. So let's talk about Moon Witch Spider King. This is by Marlon James. It's a fantasy novel, and it's the second book in the Dark Star trilogy. So here we go with the synopsis. Sagolin, the Moon Witch, proved a worthy adversary to Tracker as they clashed across a mystical African landscape in search of a mysterious boy who disappeared. In Moon Witch, Spider King, Sagolin takes center stage and gives her own account of what happened to the boy and how she plotted and fought, triumphed and failed as she looked for him. It's also the story of a century-long feud seen through the eyes of a 177-year-old witch that Sagolin had with Easy, Chancellor to the King. It's said that Easy worked so close to the king that together they are like the 8 limbs of one spider. Easy's power is considerable and deadly. It takes brains and courage to power him, to challenge him, which Sagolin does for reasons of her own. Both a brilliant narrative device, seeing the story told through the perspective of an adversary and a woman, as well as a fascinating battle between different versions of empire. Moon Witch Spider King delves into Sagolin's world as she fights to tell her own story. Part adventure tale, part chronicle on a dominant woman who bows to no man. So, this is the end of the synopsis for Moon Witch Spider King. Let's go around the table and see who would press pause or play on this fantasy tale. Starting with you, Nazreen, pause or play.
I'm usually into fantasy books, but this sounds like a really old book, so I would press pause. I'm not really into the witches' tale types of books.
Okay,
Do you
you're
get what I
more
mean?
specific on your fantasy?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question really quickly for you though.
Uh huh.
Would you read a book from like a second or third book from a trilogy, but you haven't read the first book?
I tend not to.
Yeah.
However, if it was recommended, so sometimes we've had recommendations in book clubs where we were given the second book or the third book or the sixth book in a series, but it's like the stories don't necessarily pick up where the old one left off. It's cool to know the background and all that, but it's still readable without having read the previous books. So I have read it that way and had moments where I thought, oh, I feel like I should go backwards and read the first one, but it was not a necessity. So was able to do
Gotcha.
it. Mm-hmm. You?
Cool. No, I wouldn't. It's just like a
Okay.
movie for me. I need to know. I need to know
Yeah.
what happens in the first book for me to understand it fully in detail. I need to read the first
Yeah.
couple of books.
And it's definitely something that gets caught in your head if you know already that this is not the first book of a series and you haven't read the first book. You're like, well, now you're kind of wondering if you should or
Mm-hmm.
not. Moving over to Wendy. Wendy, pause or play on Moon Witch Spider King.
I'm going to definitely play.
Nice.
Yeah, reason being that I love how there's a lot of creativity in the fantasy world, and the self-identity of different aspiration with the spider and the dark star already caught me. The dark star
okay.
part of the title already caught me into it. It's like, ooh, what's with like, this darkness, and then like how does this person come out of it, and yeah, things like that.
See, this is awesome to hear for me personally because I'm only dipping my toes into fantasy. Like, I'm not a full-fledged fantasy reader yet, but several books that I've read in a short amount of time have made me think, oh, I could be. Like, I'm starting to open my mind up about just jumping into realms, right? And hearing you, who I'm going to introduce in a second, talk about like just hearing a synopsis and saying, oh, absolutely, this is a definite play, these are the reasons why, and it's just full-fledged fantasy, makes me think, oh, cool, maybe one day down the line I could be as ready for something like this. So my personal answer to this is I'm pausing right now, mostly because of what Nisreen said. It's not the first book in the series, so I feel like I'd just be losing context or going in with the presumption that I'm losing context already. But great to hear from Wendy, who we're inviting into our book review section. So we're opening up this space to review, discuss, recommend, browse, conceptualize, and reminisce on audiobooks with Wendy Hoang, a member of the evening book club that Amir Khan facilitates, and he's our regular contributor on the show. And you're our first time guest here on the show, Wendy, so thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Looking forward to talking audiobooks with you, and going straight from your description of why you would have picked this book in the Dark Star trilogy. What draws you into a story? Not specifically an audiobook, but into a story.
I think it's about the creative process of, it takes a lot of imagination to create, and then to also, well, of course, the fantasy part, and to actually put it into words in a way that a lot of us readers can sort of find one way, shape, or form relate to the specific character, or maybe multiple characters.
So the relatability is something that should come along somewhere in the process.
Yeah, and sometimes with different characters, we kind of sort of find, well, for me anyways, how I imagine it is, it's kind of like my alter ego. If I was this
Right.
person and I had, as the character you were describing in the book that you're introducing, if I had her strength to actually go and do detective work about what happened to that lost boy, and then come out of this, whatever happened to the kingdom and the spiders, and like, whoa, that sounds like a lot of empowerment to me. So that's like, hey, sounds pretty fun.
That's fascinating to me because usually it's like, and I go back to Harry Potter, okay, my foray into fantasy. And I think, how does this guy relate to me? How does this character encompass some of the things that I've gone through in life? And you're totally flipping that concept on its head and saying, okay, but if I were this person, how could I tap into their personality, their adventure?
Exactly. We can take
Nice.
on multiple personalities in a fantasy book.
Right. Oh, you're totally selling me on fantasy, like right here, right now. This is so cool. So when you kind of talk about fantasy that way, did you go through a growing period of discovering fantasy, or do you feel like you were always kind of into it because of being able to conceptualize this way?
Uh, Oh, this is tripping back to memory lane. It was actually more
Nice.
like I always had a very active imagination.
True.
Yeah, and it got to the point where, I was kind of afraid of the dark, and being visually impaired doesn't help with the shadows. Everything looks like elongated shadows and whatnot. And as part of conquering, sort of like building understanding and conquering my fear, I started to read into fantasy books. And that not only was it interesting, but it's like, oh, maybe it wasn't, as bad as I thought. Maybe these elongated shadows just really just my shadow.
Right. Right. And then this spun into like a positive way of using your imagination, getting into fantasy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
Nice.
for sure. Positively to using imagination. I've always been creative, so I always find ways for find books. Fantasy books is one of those great things to find a lot of inspiration when it comes to creativity. Um, you can use like words, colors, even descriptive feeling. That's something that we can't always physically manifest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. You feel like you can understand just by the descriptions of what's going on.
Exactly.
So, do you enjoy the world building? I ask everyone who's come on the show this question. Do you enjoy the world building of fantasy? Because who was it who told us? Jacob Nizreen, who was like, there's soft fantasy and hard fantasy, right? Where sometimes a lot of things are left up to interpretation by the reader, and then other times
Yeah.
it's all built for you, and you got to know the rules of the game to be part of it,
Yeah, I think it
Hmm.
was Jacob who said that.
right?
Right.
Yeah. So, which side are you on, Wendy?
Hmm.
Pick a
I
side, pick a
don't
side.
know. I don't know how to answer that question, to be quite honest. I like both.
Right. So you're not well, I guess the question is, does some fantasy overwhelm you? Like are there fantasies that just feels like there's a lot to know, to grasp, to remove from reality in order to invest into that world of fantasy?
Yeah, when you put it that way, then yes. Uh, Things like suspense and horror and gore. Sorry, that's really not my not my genre.
Okay.
I like to
It's
go
not
to sleep
ours
at
either,
night.
so don't worry.
Yeah, I like to go to sleep at night, but if it's in a playful way, like kind of like Casper the Friendly Ghost kind of thing, then I really don't mind.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I wanted to ask you, knowing your love of fantasy books, do you find that there's a difference in watching like a fantasy TV show or a movie, a series that way, with the visuals, with the effects and all of that versus getting the descriptions through means of writing, so books?
Definitely with like in movies, it does have those technical details. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a lot of them quite audio described yet, or I haven't tapped into that world of it yet. So the storyline most of the time does stick to a pretty close storyline depending on the production. But then with the book, whether it's written or audio, it's sort of like you just take on your own imagination. You just have to close your eyes and, whoever you imagine the characters to be will look like what you want it to be.
Right. Which is why, like, full circle of that is when people read their favorite books and they love them, and then it gets turned into a movie or a TV series. You definitely get people talking, right? Their commentary on what was done right and wrong, and justfully so or not.
Yes, we get to nitpick.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. How about authors? So when you love a particular book, do you tend to go on an author binge of who wrote that book, or do you tend to move on to another series or a recommendation?
Oh, no, I'm not picky with authors. I just like recommendations in series.
Okay, great. So speaking of which, what would you like to recommend to our listeners, Wendy? Bring us into your world of reading.
So this is one of my favorite adolescent books when I was reading was younger. And it brought in a world where it does dealt with specters and the unknown, and it's like, oh no, this is going to be a scary thing. It does dealt with a very light version of death, but in the world across dimensions. And the book I'm recommending is by Philip Pullman. It is the second book of the Golden Compass trilogy called The Subtle Knife.
Okay. So tell us, why book 2 of the trilogy? Why that is the recommendation?
Book 2 is literally just a step into that dimension itself. We got the beginning where like, we're kind of on Earth, and then book 2 just already where we're already walking into another window, and then we're like, oh, all of these things starts to develop, and this is why this and this is why that, and the pieces started to come together before the book 3. So and it helps with the idea of like, hey, it kind of like wonders, like, for me, I would wonder, where do specters come from? Like, what is specters? How do they exist? I mean, how do they even materialize or manifest? And with this version, with the book, how it describes it in this fantasy world, it has a really interesting point, but which I'm not going to give a spoiler.
Okay. Thank you. Does it follow a character? Like, do you find that the underlying storylines as important as the overarching theme of this world?
Yeah. We always have to follow a character. But it does focus on 2 characters where the main character, Lara, meets this young boy named Will, and they cross through these different dimensions, and on not only discovering what is dust and what is specters, they have to discover their own personal journey and what their part of the role is playing in the journey that they're going through.
Interesting. And you said that this is a favorite book for you from adolescence. So is this something that you revisit a lot? And if so, yeah, why?
Yes, I think I read it 3 times already.
Nice.
I don't want to overdo it before it comes overkill. I read it when I used to have a bit more vision, so I was reading it paperback. And then I revisited reading it as a audiobook on like a YouTube channel. And then I also recently came back to it again under Sila with a synthetic audio from a different perspective or a different voice.
Interesting. More like it. So these are all 3 different forms of hearing or reading the book.
Yeah.
Okay, and how did you feel about that? Do you always go back to, because I always think like when I read something in print, I always reminisce on what it was like in print versus synth audio or even human narrated, right? Like a story being told.
Yeah. What's different is that when I was reading from print and then compared to synthetic audio, it was basically, how I imagined it. And when I was hearing it from a human narrated version, it brought in a whole new different set of emotion experience, because it will, we do rely on the voice actors
right.
to act out the book.
Yeah, the performance value. And then reading it in synth?
It was good. It was just how I imagined it when I was reading it in print.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I thought that the connection would be more similar there, like reading print versus synth audio, because you're still kind of developing the soundscape in your head, whereas versus like what you said about human narrated, where you're leaving it in the hands of the performer and just listening along. So cool. Awesome, Wendy. Well, appreciate your time, first of all, here with us on the podcast, but also the recommendation, because as I said, there's been a lot of guests who talk fantasy, and I still feel like I'm being encouraged, moving along gently towards more fantasy listens. So appreciate you bringing it to us.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Wendy Hoang joining us, our guest for today's episode of AMI Audiobook Review. We'll be back, of course, with you in a week. And until then, happy audiobook listening. I'm Ramya Amudan.
This was an AMI podcast. For more accessible media, visit ami.ca.